Okay, everyone, we are, I can hear it's that time of year when people are getting a bit stir crazy. It is that time of year when we have now got to towards the end of the first semester material. We are in the Renaissance. For England, however, because we were in the Renaissance in Italy already when we looked at Dante in the 13th century. And the English Renaissance is not unrelated to the Italian Renaissance. We're going to see in this class that some of the things that we noticed about the Italian Renaissance, its attempted revival of classical culture, is also true of the English Renaissance. And also we'll notice things like the courtly love tradition in the Italian Renaissance, which we'll also find in the English Renaissance. But the English Renaissance takes place against the backdrop of the Protestant Reformation. The two are not related, but the English Renaissance, the revival, the desire to go back to the original sources and the original texts, is concurrent with in the biblical studies with the desire to go back to the original scriptures and to translate them into the vernacular languages. Chiefly, we will note figures like William Tyndale, after which this university is named, providing a New Testament in English, and eventually that gives way by the end of the 16th century, at the beginning of the 17th century, to the authorized version of the Bible. We call it the King James in 1604. And that is, again, it's part of the whole spirit of getting back to what the original sources said and not the way in which they have been interpreted and passed on to us in the period. So there is a sort of a skepticism in the period, or at least a desire to read for oneself and understand for oneself without the mediation of the authorities per se, and a belief that, again, comes part and parcel with the English Renaissance, but not the Italian, that the tradition has to some degree, to a greater or lesser extent, perhaps lost the plot along the way and misrepresented what the original sources even said. Now, I said to you when we looked at Dante, and he was, among other things, presenting himself as an epic poet, he had not read Homer. And that's not a slight on Dante. Homer had been lost largely to the Western Christendom until the encounter between Islam and Christianity brought those texts to the knowledge of the West again. But that was after Dante. And Homer started being read again in the 16th century. You see translations and so forth, but even reading it in the original Greek, because it had been preserved in Eastern monasteries by the Eastern Church. So they had access to the Greek, many of the Greek works, and not just Homer then, but also Plato and Aristotle. Many works that had been lost to the West were rediscovered, and they became influential in the English Renaissance now. So it's a back to the sources, back to the rebirth of classical learning in a full orb sense. So a great deal of scholars in these days are, when they're studying in the institutions, universities, are reading things in the original languages. They're not, and lectures are being conveyed in Latin. And even the Reformation itself, which we associate with the translation of the Bible into, let's say, English or Luther's German, the scholars, when they write one another, are writing in Latin. And they're reading one another's Latin letters. So the language of the church and of the educated remains in Latin. And it remains in Latin all the way into the 19th century, truthfully. But it's to be found. So John Wesley in the 18th century, whom you know for Methodism, in his school, he would have been required not only to translate things from Latin into English, but English into Latin. And not just in prose, but in poetry, to the style of Latin poetry. So they're writing Latin poetry. So just to give you a sense of the character of people like Calvin, Luther, and Wesley, they are still classically educated. and it informs their whole way of understanding things and some of the features of their education, which I think we would do well to recover. But just to give you the sense that it's not a total departure suddenly from classical languages. In a sense, it's an intensification in this period. So the educated, and that is male and female, are reading in original language. That includes Queen Elizabeth, for example. She's reading Latin, she's reading Greek, and is able to engage on that front. Likewise, Henry VIII, who we associate with the startup of the Anglican Church. He is able to read in these languages. He's taught in them. And the English Renaissance then is the fusion of, in England, the fusion of Protestant Christianity to some degree, although you see Catholic aspects of it as well, with classical learning. And so Shakespeare is probably the most famous character of the age, but there are others, Sir Philip Sidney and Edmund Spenser, who was so influential on Milton and his peers, are writing in a way that is fully classical in its allusion. So it'll make reference to all the mythology of the pagan world. The stuff that we read about in Homer and in Virgil, they know all of that material, and they're happy to write about it, and yet they're writing it as Christians, and they're engaging with it on a Christian front, in the same way that C.S. Lewis does in, say, the Chronicles of Narnia, and he puts Dionysus in there. And other, it's very common in the period to write that way, and they'll refer to Jupiter or Jove as a sort of a way of referring to God. So they're happy to use classical language, even though they're not polytheists like the ancient Greeks were. So there's a transformation that goes on in that period. But the author we're going to look at today, John Donne, is going to be writing something that comes, it's still with the spirit of the Renaissance, but it's moving into a more troubled period. And he's going to write what we call metaphysical poetry. Now, metaphysical poetry is, to some degree, the product of an awareness that the culture of the past, and particularly the science of the past, is no longer adequate. So it's the product to some degree, and we're not quite that yet there at the scientific revolution. That's 1670s. And Donne is writing in the early 17th century, so 1710s and 1720s and and so on. And the scientific revolution has not yet happened. But there's an awareness that the science of old is problematic now. And it's largely led through something that we call astronomy. So you've heard of Galileo and Galileo's telescope. Galileo, with his telescope, showed and was able to observe something that the old science stated was not possible, which is that there was a nova. A nova, you know what a nova is, or a supernova. It's like a comet going across the sky. But a nova literally means something new. And the model of the universe up to this point was largely of perfection and order and harmony, and God's sovereignty working through that model. And there were no such thing as novas. And there was nothing new. There was nothing that was broken or transformative or different. And furthermore, this is why I have this picture on in the backdrop behind me here. This is the cosmology that was understood from the time of Aristotle onwards to right up until this period. It was the one in which the Earth is at the center of the whole cosmos. So this is a geocentric cosmology. Geo meaning Earth. A geocentric cosmology in which the other planets, so Lunae, Mercury, Veneris, Solus, Martis, Jovis, this is the Moon, Mercury, Venus, the Sun, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, revolve around the Earth. And then outside of all of those things, was the caelum imperium habitaculum Dei et omnium electorum, the kingdom of heaven, or the empire of heaven, the habitation of God and all the elect. So on the outside of the visible created universe, God is set up there, outside of the created cosmological order. That was the view of the church that basically took Aristotelian cosmology and regarded it as the proper scientific view of the universe, up until Galileo. Now, there's a theory even before Galileo that maybe it works rather differently. In fact, we are revolving around the sun and not the moon, or rather, not the everything's not revolving around the earth, but rather around the sun. But that was regarded as a theory that was probably not as persuasive as the Aristotelian view. But come Galileo, he shows, one, that there's a nova that goes across the heavens here, that they didn't fit into the current scheme of things. But also he observes that Jupiter has moons that go around Jupiter. So Iovis here has 4 moons that are circling around Jupiter. And that suggests that everything isn't going around the earth. That there are things going on in the whole cosmos that don't fit with this model. And the difference between what Galileo does and just a theory is he shows it with a telescope. And I think he ushers in the scientific age and the era of observation and empirical science, because he's now observing it with his eye through the means of a telescope. He can see with his naked eye through the means of the telescope that the planets are not the way the theory had presented it to be. And so now we're going to verify through empirical science. And as I say, the scientific age will build on that in the late 17th century through the Royal Society and so forth. But that's a big shift. And Galileo was observing this in the early 17th century. And John Donne will be responding to that in his poetry, the consequences of this. Because the consequences he perceives are to be vast. This is not just related to astronomy. It's the whole of the medieval worldview that's at risk here, because it's not only astronomy that's connected to it, but all of the sciences. Because the sciences are taught through what they call the 7 liberal arts. And astronomy was just one of them. Another one of them, part of the quadrivium, would be geometry, the measurement of the earth. Another would be mathematics. You might have heard of that one. Another would be music. You might have heard of that one. Those were all affected by if the astronomy is coming into doubt and cosmology, then the other sciences are implicated in the transformation. And so as he puts it in Donne, the first anniversary, Anatomy of the World. There it is. New philosophy calls all in doubt. The element of fire is quite put out. The sun is lost, and the earth, and no man's wit can well direct him where to look for it. And freely men confess that this world's spent, when in the planets and the firmament they seek so many new. They see that this whole picture is crumbled out again to his atomies. 'Tis all in pieces, all coherence gone, all just supply and all relation. Prince, subject, father, son are things forgot. For every man alone thinks that he hath got to be a phoenix, and that then can be none of that kind of which he is, but he. This is the world's condition now. And now she that should all parts to reunion bow, she that had all magnetic force alone to draw and fasten sundered parts in one, she whom wise nature had invented then when she observed that every sort of men did in their voyage in this world see stray and needed a new compass for their way. That is all gone. So I'm going to come to that picture right there. But with this astronomy, the idea that we can trust in the authorities and that there's a hierarchy within human nature that corresponds with the hierarchy that's implicit in the cosmology, that also falls to pieces. And it starts the age of individualism, radical individualism, where everyone thinks that he has to be like a phoenix. And there's no one that's ever existed like me before me, because there's a radical skepticism that is brought into the Western mind through the discovery that was brought about through Galileo's telescope. And now everyone is going to say, I'm not going to trust it unless I can prove it with my own two eyes, just like Galileo did. So that it's the beginning of a radical skepticism. As I say, it's in the 17th century. It's got nothing to do with the Reformation per se. It's more scientific discovery, although you can see in the Reformation, there's a strong motive for people to read scripture themselves and understand themselves and see what God's word says. That's already there. But this is an intensification of that, and now it's a distrust of every authority except me, myself, and I. That becomes the new Trinity. The trust in my own two senses, what I can see with my own two eyes, and verify. I will be the arbiter of truth going forward. The consequence of that, as Donne says, is that prince, subject, father, son are things forgot, because these are relationships. And all relations have been fractured when these relations are fractured. Because these relations are regarded to influence what goes on earth. It's called influence, by the way. The word influence is the word that is used to describe the relation of the planets on the earth. It's called influenza. You ever heard of influenza? It's for the word from which we get the flu. We still call it influenza. What is influenza? You know what the flu is? I'm not making a COVID comment here, by the way. You'll be glad to know. It means they have no idea. It means that it's somehow there's an influence external to us that caused the illness. And it's the influence of the planets on the earth. You want to demonstrate this, they'll say, depending on where the moon is in its cycle, we will notice that the planet Earth is affected. Have you ever seen the tides rise and the tides fall? You ever been in Atlantic Canada? Like, depending on where the moon is in its orbit, the tide will either be 20 to 40 feet higher than it is when it's out of its cycle. So we can observe that when the moon is full, that the earth is, even the water on the earth is pulled up by it. And furthermore, we will notice that when the lunae is there, that people act with lunacy. The effect of the moon on people on earth. People are influenced by the planets, and not just the moon, but the other ones higher up are also influenced by it. And furthermore, the ones on the outside influence all the ones down below it. And so depending on at what cycle the planets are when you're born, that will also be said to have some influence on the course of your life. And there'll be a lot of astrology that will will overemphasize this and make it deterministic, which is never an orthodox opinion in the church. It never has been. But they will say it's not that there's no importance to it. It's just not deterministic, because we don't live in a fatalistic, deterministic universe. God is sovereign over all things. But he does create an orderly existence. And when the medieval individual looked up at night, he looked up, but he also looked in. Now, you weren't expecting me to say that. We would say he looked up and he looked out, because we call it outer space. They had no such concept, because this is not space. There's no emptiness here. There's firmament. It's solid. It's substantial. It's more real than what happens on earth. Remember, what happens on earth waxes and wanes, and it changes. The seasons happen all the time. The cycles of life. Things are born and they die. They change. Just like the seasons. There's constant change going on here. There's mutability. But the heavens are not marked by that. The further up you go, the more eternal things are. And above all of them, the kingdom of heaven, the habitation of God and all the elect. This is an eternal realm. And we are on the outside of the city of God, because the heaven is presented as a divine city. And we are seen as on the outskirts of that city, as people that are exiles, as it were. And the voyage that we are going to undergo eventually is to go up and up and up, but also in, because we're out and we're going to go into the place to which we belong. And C.S. Lewis will use that picture in The Last Battle. If you've read any Narnia, Aslan will say, come on, children, further up and further in. Up, up, up. Yes, we get the up, but the in, because we're outside of the place of ultimate reality. That's what he's using there. Yes?
Do they have a concept of a globe at this time when they're...
Yes. Yeah, they're not flat earthers. Although the theory might exist, but yes, they have a clear theory of a globe. I think I got rid of the picture that showed that, but yes. So this is two-dimensional. It's a three-dimensional model. So this goes all the way around. And connected to the planets that are here, the 8 planets are here, there will be the musical scale, each of the 8 notes. And they're mathematically precise, the musical notes. There's a certain tone and pitch to them, right? And it's mathematically, the frequency is exact. So mathematics, which tells us truth, is connected with beauty, which we connect with music. So beauty and truth and goodness are united in this cosmology. So when Donne says that the astronomy and the new philosophy, which casts all in doubt, he's talking about even the certitudes of truth and beauty and goodness. All of those things are thrown into radical doubt. It's often attributed to the Reformation by Catholics, and to some degree even the secularists, the Enlightenment writers will attribute to Protestantism the beginning of thinking for yourself, and they're going to just go a little bit further down the path than the Protestants did, and even consider whether Christian doctrine is true. So we're starting down a path that was rightfully launched by Luther when he questioned the church. This is the standard take on it. And we're going to continue on with that path and be free thinkers. I think this misrepresents what Luther and the reformers are doing. And I think it's more the product of a scientific observation than anything else. But make no doubt, this is the product of the 17th century. And it does lead to all sorts of consequences in how the humanities and the sciences start to be reconfigured, because they are all reconfigured from the 17th century onward. And they are no longer informed by this perfect model that C.S. Lewis now calls the discarded image. I've just taught a class on C.S. Lewis, or I'm just concluding my class on C.S. Lewis, and we read that work in which he describes this medieval Renaissance model and where it came from and its function, and the fact that everyone educated would have believed in this model and the implications for it. But I said to this was appended music. The music that was posited to be in this realm beyond the moon, it was called the music of the spheres. You still hear it in, I don't know if you know any old hymns. Even going into the 19th century, they'll refer to the music of the spheres. Well, this is the constellations of the planet that make a music that is so beautiful that it transcends our capacity to hear it. It's a silent music, but it's a perfect music. And correspondent to that perfect music, we have instrumental music. And we play and we know when it's in harmony. You can hear when something's off key, right? You can recognize it. And some people can sing it. They're pitch perfect. Their voice can exactly represent that. And when we hear that instrumental music, which corresponds to the music of the spheres, it influences the sense of harmony within ourselves. This is why we love music. It suggests beauty, and it suggests order and perfection and truth and harmony. It's why people delight in music. Now, there are different types of music, but the type of music that you hear in churches historically is meant to remind you of things above and not things below. Contemporary music is mostly a lot of noise making and passion evoking, but it's not beautiful. It's not intended to lift your thoughts to transcendent things. It's meant to make you think about carnal things, material things. This is not to disparage music, contemporary music. I'll do that other times. It's not my purpose here. It's just simply to say that music is given a theological purpose in this period. You can hear it. And if it were my business to do that right now, I'd look at this further. But with this as the backdrop, let me look at 3 poems by John Donne. And I want to introduce them to you and just make some comments that will, to some degree, reflect on this cosmological shift, which augurs a larger and more significant shift that will affect literally everything. Politics, go back to this. All just supply and all relation. Prince, subject, father, son are things forgot. For every man alone thinks he hath got to be a phoenix, and that then can be none of that kind of which he is but he. Everyone starts to think of themselves as utterly unique, utterly sovereign, utterly autonomous. There is no law that rules over them except the law of the self. Did you know that the word autonomy, you heard the word autonomy before? Autonomy means the law of the self. To appeal to autonomy is to appeal to be absolutely sovereign over everything related to yourself. It's the Enlightenment ideal, by the way. It is never an ideal before the Enlightenment. It's the product of this intellectual process that John Donne's describing here. By the way, this is actually written before René Descartes, in case you're wondering. So this observation of the consequence precedes Descartes' so-called cogito. I think, therefore I am. That's a philosophical movement that is 20 to 30 years after Donne writes this poem. So let me go to the first poem I want to look at, which is called The Flea. Now, The Flea is typical. You can see Donne's years here, 1572 to 1631. Dr. John Donne is a famous preacher, Anglican, convert to Anglicanism from Catholicism, the rector at St. Paul's in London, the most famous church in London, England. This one here. And let me see here if I can see it. That's as good as any, I think. It's right by the, you can see it from the river. You know, they helpfully put but this is the Millennium Bridge that they put across it now. Oh, stop it. It was there for a second. You saw it for a brief second, and then they tick-tocked me or whatever the heck they did there. But you can see this is the Millennium Bridge, so built in 2000, it would lead you directly across to St. Paul's. So this is the church in which John Donne preached, and he was famous as an orator and preacher in his day. What he was not famous for, but which came out subsequent to his death, are these little privately poems he wrote for he and his friends. Some people question whether he wrote it after he was converted or before he was converted. And the reason why they wonder is, well, you're going to find out when you read the poem. It's rather scandalous. But remember, it was not meant for publication. It was probably meant for his learned friends. Imagine men who are writing poetry in the courtly love fashion and having fun. Writing in jest. And I think you're a little bit closer to what Donne is writing about. One final thing I want to observe is that Donne, like all of his contemporaries, regularly writes about erotic love, which we already saw Donne did in the 5th canto of the Inferno, right? Courtly love, erotic love. And when they do this, I didn't say this with respect to Donne, although perhaps I should have, but he doesn't make much of it. But in Donne's writing, it certainly is the case, and we'll see this more next time when I look at his holy sonnets, that he reflects on the relation of God to his church as the relation of a husband to an unfaithful bride. This is imagery that we see throughout Scripture. It's there in the Old Testament. It's there in the New Testament. In the New Testament, it's presented in terms of two types of people. There are two cities then. There's the city of the heavenly Jerusalem, the bride of Christ. And then there's Babylon the Great, who's described as a whore. Right? There's the holy and the unholy people and the holy people. That's the book of Revelation. If you haven't read the book of Revelation, that's how it's presented. But you will find the idea that God is a lover of his people, and his people are like a city, like Jerusalem. You can find that all over the Old Testament. Can anyone think of a passage? How well do you know your Old Testament? Anyone think of anything? Hosea, good. Excellent. That would be the first place I would say. So Hosea, the Lord began to speak through Hosea. The Lord said to him, "Go marry a promiscuous woman and have children with her, for like an adulterous wife, this land is guilty of unfaithfulness to the Lord." You want to know what it's like to be God? You represent me. You marry an unfaithful woman. That's what it's like to be me. So the people of God are presented as unfaithful, adulterous. And he explicitly puts Hosea the prophet in the position of sensing that dynamic. So that's one passage we could go to. I'm not here to do an exposition. Another one would be Ezekiel 16. Oops. Again, the word of the Lord came unto me, saying, Son of man, cause Jerusalem to know her abominations, and say, Thus saith the Lord God unto Jerusalem, Thy birth and thy nativity is of the land of Canaan. Thy father was an Amorite, and thy mother a Hittite. This is an insult. As for thy nativity in the day that I was born. So this is the allegory of unfaithful Jerusalem. And it presents a narrative of God being there at the birth of the nation, of the city, and raising the city to be, and this, it becomes a little icky there, but becoming like a beautiful young woman. And then he marries the beautiful young woman, and the young woman is serially unfaithful to him, going after other gods, which in scripture is often called harlotry. To go after other gods aside from the Lord God is presented as an act of harlotry, which is not very popular in our day to speak of it in such terms, but those are the terms that scripture uses to talk about a relational corruption and conflict, hatred even. And yet, God is presented in the New Testament as a husband who loves his faithful bride and will give her new clothing, etc. I could get into that, but that analogy there, I just want that in your mind, because when he writes the flea, he has those complicated pictures in his mind. So you know what a flea is, first of all. I think. I don't need to explain what a flea is, and you probably prefer not to know what a flea is, but they're icky little black things that bite you and suck your blood. And what Donne is going to do with the flea is to use one of his favorite poetic devices. It's called a metaphysical conceit. And it's also, he uses a relationship called a microcosm to a macrocosm. So first let me write down a metaphysical conceit. And he will also employ the relationship of a let me try that again, cosm to a macrocosm. So metaphysical conceit, first of all, is an explanation of something in accordance with a sort of an analogy that's entirely unlikely or inappropriate even. Not many people are going to take well to being compared to a flea. Even more so the case, they're not going to want to see any analogy between a flea and themselves. So the microcosm, the little flea, by the word cosm here, is the same word from which we get cosmology. And a cosmos is a little world, it's the word from which we get cosmetics. It suggests beauty. It suggests perfection. It suggests heaven. When you put on cosmetics, you're making your face shine like the heavens. It's the same word that they use in Greek for like an ornament. So it says something about what the ancient world thought when they looked up at the heavens. It's like a beautiful ornament. Just think about it on a beautiful day or a night, or the starry sky and so forth. They see the beauty of it. And the heavens declare the glory of God. Right? So that sense of the cosmos. But the microcosm of the flea reflects the macrocosm of the person. And so everything he's going to say about the flea will also apply to the woman. And that's because, again, in the Renaissance mind, everything in some sense is related to everything else. They're all composed of the same elements. There's a relationship between everything which is to be understood and hold true. And he's going to continue to insist that these things hold true, while at the same time being the guy in Dr. Donne who has said that the new philosophy has suggested that all of these things are gone, all the relations. There is no analogy between microcosm and macrocosm. My personal sense of justice is not the same thing as justice. I have a private sense of justice, but it's not what justice is for everyone else. That's all gone. I'm now appealing to my own sense of justice, which may or may not be your sense of justice. So in other words, it begins relativism. This is the beginning of relativism. It's not full-orbed yet, but it's moving in that direction. Donne sees way ahead. What he observes right away, we will see is not fully grasped for another few centuries, but he sees it immediately with great acuity as well, I will say. So let me read that. So this is the flea, and it was published after his death, posthumously, the elegies and songs and sonnets of John Donne. And I'll read through the whole thing, and then I'll go back and make comments about it. But here we go. And he's going to do it sort of like let me see if I put it larger so you can see it. Can you see this at the back? Anyway, even if you can't, I'm going to read it here. He's going to basically point to it as an example, an illustration, like a preacher would. Take something as an example of something else and then make analogies from this. Mark but this flea, and mark in this how little that which thou deniest me is. Me it sucked first, and now sucks thee, and in this flea our two bloods mingled be. Confess it. This cannot be said a sin or shame or loss of maidenhead. Yet this enjoys before it woo, and pampered swells with one blood made of two. And this, alas, is more than we would do. Imagine the person he's speaking to is a young woman who he's trying to bed. Again, I say it's scandalous. This is Dr. Donne, the great Anglican preacher, speaking about a young man who's trying to seduce a young woman. And he uses the analogy of a flea to say the flea didn't ask for permission before biting you. It bit your blood and now it bites mine, and the bloods that are inside the flea's body are a union of the two persons, in the same way that in Scripture we talk about a man and a woman being united and being one flesh. The one flesh is in the flea. Because with the blood, scripturally way of thinking about blood connotes life. Right? When Cain slays his brother Abel, God says that his blood cries out to me from the ground. So it's a figure of speech, but still, it's one that Donne is happy to lay onto. Now, he's suggesting that in relation to the flea, because he's saying that the flea is already doing the thing that you won't do. So you're saying no. And I'm saying, but it's already done. Because the flea's already done the thing that you won't, and the flea didn't even ask, let alone try to woo you. Scandalous. Do you understand the scandal? Do you follow the language here? Or am I going too quickly? Not quite. Okay. So what is lacking in this? The understanding of biology here is not the biological understanding of our day. Remember, they don't have a microscope. They understand when two people come together in sexual relations that their bloods are mingled in some way, and that's how the life comes about. There's some sort of union of the two persons, and that unification of the two lives creates a new life. It's not that they don't understand that there's something besides blood there, but it's what's going on is the union, and that's what creates the new life, is that sort of union to become one flesh, and as a result, children result from that. But there's a unification of two diverse things, separate things, and the flea represents that thing. And it swells up. Well, when a flea bites you, it gets bigger and bigger, just like a mosquito. It starts swelling up with the blood, just like when you squish a mosquito and the blood goes. Same here. Anything? Is it clear now? Okay. You know too much about biology now. Use the biology of the 16th century, 17th century, and then you get the same sense here. He could talk about eggs and sperm and all that sort of thing, but again, he won't see that down in its microscopic. But they do understand at the end of the day, we have two people whose life is connoted by their blood, and now the two bloods come together, and that makes a new person. Yeah. Anyway, sorry if it's icky. Anyway. So there's progress in the poem. So the opening gambit is the idea that the flea has consummated a relationship without asking. And it already did it without wooing, and you're saying no. And it's too late, because the flea's already done it. So, and this is a false argument, so if the flea's already done it, then stop resisting. Just, okay. And you can imagine the woman's response to this is, if that is the flea and that is the union of the two of us, then I'm going to take care of this argument right away, and I'm going to kill the flea. And he says, oh, stay. Oh, stop. Oh, stay. 3 lives in 1 flea spare. Now, up to this point, there were 2. What's with the 3? Well, there's another life. 3 lives and 1 flea spare, where we almost, nay, more than married are. This flea is you and I, and this our marriage bed and marriage temple is. Though parents grudge, and you, we are met and cloistered in these living walls of jet. Though use make you apt to kill me, let not to that self-murder added be, and sacrilege, 3 sins in killing 3. I said I was going to read it through, and I'm doing exactly what I said I wouldn't do, and I'm commenting all along, but I'll do that. I'll read through it at the end. So he presents the flea. First of all, the flea's already a metaphysical conceit, and it's a microcosm, and now he's going to put other images on top of it. So it is the two of them, but it's also, he compares it first to a marriage bed, where a marriage is consummated. He makes it a marriage temple, where love is revered. And finally, he presents it as a cloister, where nuns go to avoid contact with the opposite sex. So it's progressively more sacred. The image, by the way, it's all tongue-in-cheek. Don't take Donne to be serious, because he's not serious. At least I don't think he's serious. And he says, so having sanctified the flea to the point where it's now like a cloister where nuns go to live and don't have any interaction with the opposite sex, he then insults her and says, though use make you apt to kill me is to consummate, to have sexual intercourse. And he suggests that she's already used to it. Though use make you apt to kill me. Now, he may not be referring to her particularly, but he's referring to the sex, the female sex. You're already part of the adulterous female kind that commits serial adultery, just like the harlot presented in Old Testament. So it's deliberately insulting. Now, is there actually a woman that he's writing this to? I don't think so. I think he's toying with the conventions that he finds in Scripture and the courtly love conventions and so forth. Use makes you apt to kill me. Let not to that self-murder add to be, because if she kills the flea, she's killing herself, because her life, that is the blood, is in the flea. So don't kill yourself as well. And sacrilege, why is it sacrilege? Because it's in the cloister or the temple. 3 sins in killing 3. So he blows up the flea and makes it of enormous sacred significance and tells her not to do it. And then she says, enough of this, and actually does kill it. Now, have you ever tried to kill a flea? How do you do it? You don't. It's really hard. Like, the bodies are really hard. You can squeeze them with your fingers and it doesn't happen. Yeah, I put them in some water and then they sit there, and I was like, when I'm really angry at the flea, that I throw it in water and just watch them. And I say, you sit there and you learn. He just sits there, and I can imagine him looking up, and I say, yeah, you just sit there. But anyway, but you're not killing him. He's just stuck in the water. You can't get out of it. To kill it, you actually have to squeeze it with your nails. Like, you actually have to, the hardness of your nails to kill it. That's what he has in mind here. And he builds on this now. Cruel and sudden, hast thou since purpled thy nail in blood of innocence? In what could this flea guilty be, except in that drop which it sucked from thee? Yet thou triumphst, and sayest that thou find'st not thyself nor me the weaker now. 'Tis true. Then learn how false fears be. Just so much honor, when thou yields to me, will waste, as this flea's death took life from thee. So she, understanding he's speaking figuratively, says there's no literal significance to the death of the flea, despite everything that you've just said. There's no literal significance whatsoever. And he flips it around and says, yes, then there's no literal significance when thou yields to me to what you are about to do. So that's the twist in the tale at the end. No? Get it? No? Funny? Not? The metaphysical period is marked by excessive learning. It's deliberately witty. It's learned humor. That's not ha-ha, split your sides, dumb and dumber, fart humor. It's witty. The more knowledgeable you are, the more you see humor in it. But again, you're not going to be rolling on the ground with laughter. But it's conspicuous, ostentatious shows of learning. So here, for example, when he says, hast thou since purpled thy nail in the blood of innocence, did you see a reference to anything there? The cross, yeah. The blood of innocence was the blood of Christ, and Christ wears purple, the king, and he's nailed to the cross. Have you just committed sacrilege? You've just crucified the Lord. Does he mean it seriously? Of course not. In what could this flea guilty be? And now everything that he blew up to be of theological, sacred significance, he just says, it's just a little flea. What did it did? It just, all it did is bit your blood. It took a little blood from you. What's wrong with you? And then and you say, neither of us are weaker now. Well, that's true. In which case, all your objections are moot. There's no reason. And he goes back to his beginning gambit, which is, come on. Here we go. Anyway, it's it's got a tone of tongue-in-cheek. I don't think he's serious about it, but there's a lot of this, and it's almost the sort of thing that you would, it's to some degree immature. It's men writing to other men in that sense. But you can see that it's full of analogies that he gets that are theological in import and biblical and cosmological. And he's giving so much significance to the little microcosm of the flea that he's almost suggesting that it is of universal significance. This flea, it's a macrocosm for all justice, all goodness, all virtue, all holiness. This little holy flea. And then when she pops the balloon and say that's a bunch of nonsense, he says, well, yeah, it is nonsense. So why are you objecting? He just keeps coming back to it. But that's it. So that's the flea. It's a delightful little poem, or not, but it is what it is. It's well known. Let me come to another one. This is called the canonization. You know what? I'm going to skip the canonization because I won't get to it. I don't have time for it. I'm going to do a valediction forbidding mourning because I have just enough time to do that. Now, do you know what a valediction is, first of all? I don't think this is a word that I've ever heard used in contemporary English. A valediction. You may not know what this is. Do you know of any words that we use in English that sound something like it? Yes. Good. And what does a valedictorian do? A speech. Yes. And what's the occasion for the speech? It's correct. Okay. So the person that is the most promising, that somebody is chosen from the class to speak to the class. And what is the context for the speech of the best in the class? Why is he speaking to the rest of them? Correct. It's the graduation and it's goodbye. The valedictorian is speaking on the occasion of, they're going to say vale, health, to toast to you as we part ways. So the valedictorian is giving a diction, a speech of health, cheers to your health, to your future prosperity. All my friends, I've been with you for 4 years, whatever. Now we're going to go our separate ways. Off you go. That's a valediction, and that's what the valedictorian does. That's you will hear one here at the end of your 4 years at Tyndale. There'll be a valedictorian. They'll give a speech. That's the farewell speech. It's a scene of some sadness, if you have a sense of what's going on there. You've concluded a chapter in your life. On the other hand, there's a hopefulness to it going forward. But this is a valediction, and it's forbidding mourning. You're not to be sad. So that the title is very helpful here. And he will begin with a figure of speech, which you probably know from high school, but you might not. It begins with, as virtuous men pass mildly away and whisper to their souls to go. What do we call this figure of speech? Does anyone know? A comparison using like or as. What do we call that? It's a simile. So it is a simile whereby one thing is compared to another. They have a similitude, a similarity, a likeness. Remember what he said in an Anatomy of the World, that all those relations are gone. Those likenesses, those analogies, those similarities. But this is a simile. It's making a comparison. And the comparison it makes in the very first 4 lines is one that will govern the entire poem. So keep it in your mind. So as virtuous, now this time I'm actually going to read it through and do what I say I'm going to do. I'm going to read it all the way through and then I'll come back. As virtuous men pass mildly away and whisper to their souls to go, while some of their sad friends do say, the breath goes now, and some say, no. So let us melt and make no noise. No tear floods nor sigh tempests move. 'Twere profanation of our joys to tell the laity our love. Moving of the earth brings harms and fears. Men reckon what it did and meant. But trepidation of the spheres, though greater far, is innocent. Dull, sublunary lovers love, whose soul is sense, cannot admit absence, because it doth remove those things which elemented it. But we, by a love so much refined that ourselves know not what it is, interassured of the mind, careless eyes, lips, and hands to miss. Our two souls, therefore, which are one, though I must go, endure not yet a breach, but an expansion, like gold to airy thinness beat. If they be two, they are two so as stiff twin compasses are two. Thy soul, the fixed foot, makes no show to move, but doth if the other do. And though it in the center sit, yet when the other far doth roam, it leans and hearkens after it, and grows erect as that comes home. Such wilt thou be to me, who must like the other foot obliquely run. Thy firmness makes my circle just, and makes me end where I begun. Now, I want you to come back to this and bear this in mind in this poem. These perfect concentric spheres, symbols of perfection, symbol of eternal, just like a ring, symbol of eternity, symbol of perfection, symbol of unity, symbol of marriage. The opening line, make it even bigger. The opening line is how a virtuous man dies. Do we know what virtuous means? We probably do, but do we mean it in the sense that Donne means virtuous here? We don't learn Latin anymore, so I'm not assuming anything, but yes?
Someone who possesses the virtues versus the vices.
Yes, that will be true. Correct. And what will the virtues point to? A piety, a right relation to God. Right? Within the word virtuous is this little 3-letter word vir, or sometimes weird, depending on how you want to read it. But vir, which is a man. A virtuous man is a manly man. But what's the standard of manliness? Who is the standard of manliness? This is one where you should all get the... Yes, thank you. Yes. The standard of manliness is the God-man. And the godly man gave up his life to death on a cross mildly. He didn't resist it. Similarly, somebody who has faith in Christ, when they die, know that death will not be the end of their life, so they go with peace in their hearts. They're possessing of the virtue of faith, which is given to them, and so they're courageous, facing something that everyone's terrified of in their natural flesh, terrified of death, the undiscovered country, as Shakespeare calls it, the place we know not where. But the virtuous man does not die in terror, because he has the assurance that he will be raised and will see Christ again. Death is not the end of his life. So a virtuous man passed mildly away, quietly, without any mourning. Remember, it's called a valediction forbidding mourning. As virtuous men pass mildly away and whisper to their souls to go, while some of their sad friends do say the breath goes now, and some say no, so let us melt. So just like the virtuous man, let's us do likewise. And make no noise. No tear floods nor sigh tempests move. Now I want to just pause here for a second. What are these references suggesting? We speak in English to this day of floods of tears. When somebody's really crying uncontrollably, talk about floods of tears and sighing like tempests, like a big loud sighs. And we are comparing them to tempests and floods. What are floods and tempests? Where do those take place? The sea, or just more broadly, on Earth. Like it's got a, so the microcosm of the individual suggests a broader sphere, like the Earth, like the microcosm, macrocosm. When I cry, I have floods of tears. Well, a flood happens on a bigger scale than me. And when I sigh like a tempest, the analogy, which we don't even think about, is a tempest is like a storm. And the contrast could not be starker. The comparison is between no noise and the opposite of this: great wailing and lamenting and crying and wailing. And he goes on to say, "'Twere profanation of our joys, the joys of heavenly bliss that awaits us on the other side of death, to tell the laity our love." Let's do it quietly. So it begins with asking his wife, his beloved. It's unclear. It doesn't matter here, actually. But some woman, unnamed, unknown, but let's say his wife, because it makes sense. As we're parting, don't make a scene. Just quietly accept and trust that this will not be the end, as opposed to that. So have faith in this. Just like virtuous men, when they die, do so with quietness in the face of the greatest calamity that can happen to a person, of death. Do likewise when we part ways, because he's about to go away and she's going to stay at home. So that's the first two. And then he draws a comparison. And the comparison I'm going to submit to you here in these 4 lines is going to compare cosmologies. On the one hand, this cosmology, with the perfection of the spheres, with the music of the spheres, the silent spheres of perfection, moving and influencing in an unseen fashion, as opposed to the one in which, is the earth moving in this one? No, it's at the center, and the sun revolves around it. But in the new cosmology, the sun is at the center, it's heliocentric, and the earth is moving around the sun at great speed then. Do you feel the earth moving around the sun right now? Can you feel it at all? No. But your understanding of cosmology, if the solar system in which the heliocentric view is true, you can't trust your senses anymore, because you're moving at great speed and you have no sense that you're moving at all. In fact, you feel like you're standing still. That's what he's suggesting here. This new cosmology, whereby everything's moving and it brings harms and fears, and they reckon what it did and meant, they don't even know what the movement of things means, is to be contrasted with its opposite, the old cosmology, where there is a trepidation of the sphere, and it's greater far, but it's innocent. Now, when he says it's innocent, this word fears in Latin means nocere. Nocere. The verb is nocere. And the word innocent, the word innocent means not harmful, by the way. That's what innocent means. So the slaughter of the innocents by Herod, when he orders all those under 2, and it's called the slaughter of the innocents, it's the slaughter of the helpless. Those that could do no harm to anyone are being harmed. That's the atrocity. But there's a direct contrast between the harms and fears of the one cosmology with the greater perfection and the harmlessness of the other. So again, he's comparing him and his wife with I refer you to a perfect cosmology of symbolic circular order. And he'll continue on with this in the next stanza: dull sublunary lovers love. So those whose love is under the influence of the moon, and therefore they're crazy, whose soul is sense, cannot admit absence, because it doth remove those things which elemented it. So people who think that their love it's purely a material, physical thing, will of course lament when somebody goes away, just like your dog. When you leave, he's losing his mind. When are you going to come back? And you come back and they're like, oh, there he appeared. He's back. Great joy. Left, not sure he was ever going to come back. Don't be like the dog. I'm going away, but you know in your mind, in your soul, that I'm not away from you, even though I'm parted from you. Don't be like a sublunary lover who only loves what they can see in front of them, and therefore are not to be trusted, because as soon as the beloved goes away, then a new lover comes in and, oh, this'll do. Mutability, inconstancy. Don't be like this. Have a different love, a divine love. But we by love so much refine that ourselves know not what it is, interassured of the mind, care less eyes, lips, and hands to miss. Our two souls, therefore, which are one, though I must go, endure not yet a breach, but an expansion like gold to airy thinnest beat. Now, what do you know about gold? What do you know about the metal gold? Sorry? Oh, it's soft. Yes, very malleable. Very soft. Yes. And that's why it's good for jewelry. And also because it's shiny. It attracts the light and it reflects the light and so forth. But it's soft, so you can put it around other things and you can adorn it. And then it suggests wealth and all sorts of things. But the symbol for gold in alchemy is this one here, the solus. In alchemy, this is the symbol for gold, a dot in the middle of a circle. It's what kings wear, gold, as all sorts of connotations, but you can see that it's a symbol that's connected with the sun. And when you beat it, and it's soft, but it's also it's very pliable. You can smash it so that it's so thin, yet it holds together. And so we will be like gold that is stretched and still connected. And it's so thin that you can barely see the metal now, but it's still connected by a thread that's almost invisible. So we'll be like that, although we go away and we separate. And so that's the first image he uses. And again, it's, I think, cosmological. But then he uses his next analogy, and this is the great metaphysical conceit of this poem, is that he compares his beloved to something that no woman would ever want to be compared to, or the relationship. Unless it's a mathematician or something, let's think of ourselves like a pair of compasses. You know what a pair of compasses are? You remember mathematics, geometry? Yes? The metal thing where it's got the pointy, sharp thing, and you put a pencil in the one side and then you flip it around and you create a circle with it. So let's think of ourselves like a pair of compasses. Thy soul, though it in the center, if they be two, like stiff twin compasses are two, thy soul, the fixed foot, makes no show to move, because it sits in the center. It doesn't move. It just sticks there. But it doth if the other do. And how does it move, though? Well, it just sort of moves like that. The foot doesn't move, but the head does. It leans after the other one. Though it in the center sit, yet when the other far doth roam, it leans and hearkens after and goes erect as that comes home. When it finally comes back together, then you put the two together, fine. But until that point, it draws a perfect circle, which he's already given the suggestion in relation to the gold. Because if you take a pair of compasses and you draw a dot in the middle and you circle around it, you'll get exactly this picture again. And though it in the center sit, yet when the other far doth roam, it leans and hearkens after and grows erect as that comes home. Such wilt thou be to me, who must, like the other foot, obliquely run. You know an oblique angle is. You're going to go out from this. And thy firmness makes my circle just and makes me end where I begun. So again, all reinforcing what he began in the very first stanza, which is the simile of not making any noise and staying silent and staying calm. and not mourning his absence. So repeated emphasis on the same sorts of images, but he uses a whole plethora of imagery to suggest a type of love which is a spiritual love more than a physical love, and is superior for that. It's a symbol of heavenly love, just like it's a symbol of cosmological love. It's the love of God expressed through all of the relations of the world. There's a perfection and an order and a beauty to it that is not to be understood materially. Because if it's understood materially, it will only mean chaos and absence. So the beginning of this new cosmology is the beginning of a materialistic cosmology that we're going to see characterizes the world next semester. Godless materialism becomes the order of the day come the Enlightenment. And it begins with a cosmological shift, I think. But it's expressed in this poem. Do you have any questions? I've used my time here. I haven't left any time for that. Questions or interruptions, because I went through the whole poem and then back through it. And I picked out some of it. I could talk about how the meter reinforces the themes as well, but that would be another half hour. And the rhyme and so forth. Because it's all perfectly ordered. You'll note that the language, it has a regularity to it. And there's a sound to it that reinforces the sense of order and disruption. Some of the lines, actually, if I wanted to show you this, where it says, and the way the lines are enjambed and so forth, also reinforces the sense of order and disorder, and the two clashing. It's a perfect little poem. It's suggesting through its form what its content is also presenting to us. So this is a little piece of art. This is what I want to say about poetry as it used to be written, is it's not expressing the feelings of the author only, it's expressing the feelings of the author united to a sense of knowledge that's expressed in the ordering of words and the sound of words that express a harmony that is metrically regular or irregular when he chooses it to be. And the regularity suggests a harmony, and the harmony suggests a perfection higher than that of just the sounds of words. Because everyone, when you hear rhyme, is children love rhyme, and they think that poems should have rhyme. It's not a poem if it doesn't have rhyme. They like nursery rhymes. They like the regularity and the order and the harmony that's suggested by nursery rhymes. It suggests a world that is better than the world in which we live. It's a moral canvas in which there's a good is confronting evil in some ways. It lifts our eyes and our spirits upwards. That's what this poem does by the way in which it is written, not just the content. I focused on the content because that's the easiest thing for me to present to you, but I could say that the form of it does the exact thing. It reinforces the content. And that is what good art does. Just like a painting, I could show you with a painting or with a piece of music exactly the same thing. It's teaching you something as well as delighting you. Okay, well, there are no questions, so we're done for today. Next time, we're going to go back to Dr. Donne, and we will look at some of his holy sonnets. And unsurprisingly to you, probably after everything I've just said about Dr. Donne, when he, and this is what my old professor taught me 17th century, said, whenever Donne seems to be talking about sex, he's probably talking about the love of God. When he's talking about the love of God, he's probably referring to sex, because he flips the two around and he's connecting, and he particularly focuses on those passages in Scripture where God is presented as a husband who has a faithless bride. He's constantly thinking of that analogy and the way it permeates Scripture. Anyway, okay, we're done for today.